Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a really crucial issue: interpersonal violence among young people here in the United States.
Mhm.
We've got a fascinating 1995 paper titled Adolescents at Risk for Violence that we're going to unpack.
Yeah, it's a really detailed look back.
Think of this as taking a detailed look back at what youth violence looked like in the mid-90s. Our goal for you listening in is to really understand the scope and nature of this problem as it was understood then, drawing out the key insights from this, well, comprehensive analysis.
Let's get right into it. Where should we start? Homicide.
Yeah, let's get right into it, starting with the most severe end of the spectrum:
Yep.
homicide.
Homicide, as this paper lays out very clearly, is the intentional killing of one person by another. Simple definition, but profound consequences.
And how was this tracked back then, nationally?
Well, when we look at how this was tracked nationally, there were two primary sources for data: the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, using death certificates, and then the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program, the UCR.
Right, the UCR.
What's quite interesting is that even though they used different methods to collect their information, the overall picture they painted of homicide numbers and rates was, very consistent. Pretty similar findings.
And the sheer scale of homicide in the U.S. at that time is really sobering, isn't it?
It really is.
This paper points out that compared to other industrialized nations, the U.S. had a significantly higher rate, with over 20,000 homicides occurring each year back then.
Yeah, over 20,000 annually.
And here's a statistic that really hits home. Firearms were involved in 2 out of every 3 of those homicides in 1991.
Two-thirds. That immediately tells you something important about the nature of lethal violence among us, especially the role of guns.
Absolutely. And what was particularly alarming then, and honestly remains a critical concern, is the disproportionate involvement of adolescents and young adults, those between, 10 and 24.
Right, ages 10 to 24, as both victims and those arrested for these crimes. In 1991, this age group accounted for a full third of all homicide victims.
A third. Wow.
And over half, over 55% of all arrests for murder. That concentration really underscores how deeply violence was impacting younger generations.
It really does. And when you start to break down those numbers by age, sex, and race, some really stark disparities emerge, don't they?
They certainly do.
As you might expect, within that 10 to 24 age range, the likelihood of being a homicide victim generally increased with age. In 1990, for example, it was about 2 per 100,000 for 10 to 14-year-olds.
Pretty low for the youngest group.
But that jumped dramatically to over 22 per 100,000 for those aged 20 to 24.
A huge jump. And tragically, males were far more likely to be victims. The rate was over 23 per 100,000 compared to under 5 per 100,000 for females. Big difference.
And if we connect this back to broader societal issues, the data on race and ethnicity are particularly troubling.
Yes, the paper highlights that in 1990, homicide rates were highest among Black individuals, both male and female.
For Black males aged 20 to 24, the rate was astonishing: 170 per 100,000.
170.3, yeah. It really points to the deep-seated inequalities and systemic issues that create such tragic disparities in violence.
The arrest data for homicide in 1991 mirrors this grim picture, while the peak for arrests was among young adults aged 18 to 24.
Their rate was about 37 per 100,000.
Right. What's particularly striking is that the arrest rate for juveniles, those aged 10 to 17, was nearly double that of adults aged 25 and older. Their rate was 12.4 compared to 7.0 for older adults.
Double. Juveniles double the rate of older adults.
Yeah. And again, within that younger group, males were 20 times more likely to be arrested for homicide than females. 20 times.
And the racial disparity was huge, too. Black juveniles were 7 times more likely than white juveniles to be arrested in 91. These aren't just small differences. They are massive overrepresentations.
Definitely. This raises a really important question about how these trends evolved over time, right?
Yes, the paper looks back several decades, from 1963 to 1990, and notes a significant overall increase in the U.S. homicide rate, about a 104% increase overall.
But for youth aged 10 to 24, that increase was far more dramatic, wasn't it?
Oh, much more. A 286% increase for that age group. The most staggering jump was among 15 to 19-year-olds, whose rate increased 372%. It went from 3.6 to 17.0 per 100,000.
More than quadrupled. And what's really concerning is that much of this increase happened very rapidly, with the rate doubling in just the 5 years between 1985 and 1990.
Exactly. A doubling in just 5 years. That's incredibly fast.
And it wasn't just the older teens. The 20 to 24-year-old group also saw a substantial increase, about 165%, and even the youngest in that 10 to 24 bracket, the 10 to 14-year-olds, experienced a 250% rise in homicide rates during that period.
So, across the board for young people, but especially sharp for teenagers, these aren't just minor fluctuations. They represent a really profound shift in the landscape of violence affecting young people.
What's fascinating and deeply concerning when we look at the racial dimensions of these trends is that while in 1963 the homicide rate for young black males was about 10 times higher than for young white males.
A 10-to-1 ratio? Historically huge.
Right. That ratio had slightly decreased by 1990 to about 8 to 1.
Okay, so a slight narrowing.
However, the recent increases leading up to 1990 were actually more pronounced among young black males. Their rate jumped 121% between 84 and 90,
Compared to?
compared to a 38% increase for young white males in that same short time frame. So this suggests that while the historical disparity was immense, the factors driving the surge in violence in the late 80s and early 90s had a particularly acute impact on this group.
Yeah, that's a really critical nuance. The rate of increase was faster for young black males recently, even if the overall ratio narrowed slightly over the longer term.
And we absolutely can't talk about homicide trends without addressing the role of firearm.
No, impossible.
Yeah.
The paper makes it clear that the increase in firearm-related homicides among youth aged 10 to 24 was a major driver of the overall rise in violence.
Major.
In fact, the firearm homicide rate for this age group increased fivefold between 1963 and 1990, 5 times higher. And that increase accounted for 84% of the total increase in youth homicide during that time.
Wow. So the rise in youth homicide was overwhelmingly a rise in firearm homicide.
Precisely. This really underscores the critical link between firearm availability and the lethality of youth violence.
It truly does. And the trend in juvenile homicide arrests for those aged 10 to 17 also mirrors this disturbing pattern, right?
Yes, it showed a fourfold increase between the mid-1960s and 1991, reaching the highest level recorded up to that point and doubling just since the mid-1980s. This rapid escalation in juvenile involvement in homicides is a really alarming indicator.
Now, when we think about homicide, there's often this image, maybe from movies or news, of a random act committed by a stranger during a crime.
Right, this sort of wrong place, wrong time scenario.
But the paper challenges that assumption pretty strongly. It points out that in 1991, only about 21% of homicides were committed by someone the victim didn't know during the commission of another crime.
Exactly. Only about a fifth fit that stranger crime narrative. In reality, the paper found that nearly half, 47%, of all homicide victims knew their assailant in some way.
Knew them how?
Well, about 12% were related and 34% were acquainted, so people they knew. Only about 15% were committed by complete strangers overall.
And tragically, when we look specifically at female homicide victims, over a quarter, 28%, were killed by their husbands or boyfriends.
Yeah, highlighting the devastating issue of intimate partner violence and domestic violence.
And when we focus specifically on homicides involving young people, the paper reveals that a majority, 58% of victims between the ages of 10 and 24, were killed by someone else in that same age range between 1980 and 1991.
So young people killing other young people.
Yes. Furthermore, in the vast majority of these homicides, around 90%, the victim and the perpetrator were of the same race.
90% intraracial. That suggests that much of youth homicide is happening within social circles and communities, not typically across racial lines.
Okay, so shifting our focus from homicide to other forms of violent crime, what does the paper say?
Right. The paper introduces the National Crime Victimization Survey, or NCVS. What's really valuable about the NCVS is that it's a survey of households, asking people directly about their experiences with crime.
So it captures things that might not get reported to the police.
Exactly. It picks up data on crimes like assault, robbery, and rape, even if they weren't officially reported. This gives us a more comprehensive picture than relying solely on police reports, the UCR data.
Got it. So when we talk about assault in this context, what does that mean?
It means an unlawful physical attack or threat. And this can range from a simple threat, like verbally threatening someone, all the way to aggravated assault, which is more serious. Maybe a weapon is used or serious injury is likely.
Okay, and robbery.
Robbery is the completed or attempted theft of property directly from a person, but crucially, it involves using force or the threat of force, like a mugging.
Okay. And how did youth factor into these crimes as victims?
Well, just as we saw with homicide, adolescents and young adults were disproportionately affected as victims of these types of crimes, too. In 1991, those aged 12 to 24 accounted for over half. 55% of all victims of aggravated assault among those 12 and older,
Over half.
and a significant percentage, 44%, of robbery victims as well. This age group was clearly at a heightened risk of experiencing violent victimization beyond just homicide.
The demographics of who is most likely to be a victim of assault and robbery in 1991, according to the NCVS data, really paint a picture of vulnerability, don't they?
They do. The highest rates were among males, individuals aged 12 to 24, Black and Hispanic people, those who were single, separated, or divorced.
Also people with lower incomes, right? Under $10,000 a year.
Yes, definitely lower income levels. Also residents of central cities, and interestingly, individuals who had recently moved living at their current residence for less than 6 months.
That's interesting. It suggests a concentration of risk in certain demographic and socioeconomic groups, and maybe some instability factors like moving frequently.
And the paper makes a really important point about the racial differences we see in violent crime victimization here. It suggests that these differences appear to be strongly linked to underlying socioeconomic factors.
How so?
Well, the data indicated that low-income white individuals experienced similar rates of violent victimization as low-income Black individuals. And similarly, higher-income white individuals had rates comparable to higher-income Black individuals.
So poverty seems to be a stronger driver than race itself, according to this data.
That's what this analysis suggests. It really underscores the powerful role that economic circumstances play in exposure to violence.
Unfortunately, adolescents also figure prominently as those involved in committing these crimes.
Yes, in 1991, individuals under the age of 25 accounted for a large percentage of arrests for both aggravated assault, 43%, and robbery, 62%.
Wow, 62% of robbery arrests were people under 25.
Yeah. The highest arrest rates for these crimes were among 18 to 24-year-olds. Their rates were about 517 for assault and 247 for robbery per 100,000. They were followed by those aged 10 to 17 and then adults 25 and older.
And within the juvenile age group, 10 to 17, I assume similar patterns by sex and race?
Yes, arrest rates for aggravated assault and robbery were notably higher for males and for Black individuals among those juveniles.
Okay, what about trends over time for assault and robbery? Do they increase like homicide?
Well, when we examine the trends in assault and robbery victimization between the early 1970s, specifically 1973 and 1991, what's interesting is that the overall rate for the entire U.S. population remained relatively stable.
Okay, so not a huge overall jump.
Right. However, for youth aged 12 to 24, there was a concerning increase in violent crime victimization, about 32% in the latter part of that period, specifically between 1986 and 1991.
And what drove that increase for youth?
It was largely driven by a rise in assault rates, about a 31% rise for that age group in just those 5 years. So while the overall picture wasn't drastically changing, young people were increasingly bearing the brunt of violent crime, especially assault.
And when we break down those assault victimization trends by even younger age groups, looking at 12 to 15-year-olds, 16 to 19-year-olds, and 20 to 24-year-olds, any standouts?
Yes, the paper highlights that the most significant increase in assault victimization rates over the longer period, 1973 to 1991, occurred among the 16 to 19-year-old group. Their rate went up 57%.
Okay, so that late teen group really saw a big jump in assaults. What about juvenile arrests for these crimes?
The arrest rates for juveniles aged 10 to 17 for both aggravated assault and robbery also show significant increases when we look back from the mid-1960s, 1965 to 1991.
How big were the increases?
Aggravated assault arrests for juveniles went up 327% over that time, and the largest increases actually occurred more recently, since 1983. Robbery arrests for juveniles increased 165% between 65 and 91, reaching their highest level since 1978.
So a huge jump in juvenile assault arrests, especially in the 80s, and a significant rise in robbery arrests, too.
Definitely,
Yeah.
suggesting more juvenile involvement over time.
So when we consider the circumstances surrounding these assaults and robberies, what does the paper tell us about who is involved, similar to homicide?
It seems so. The paper suggests that young victims often know their attackers, and that the victim and perpetrator are often similar in age and race.
And for younger teens?
For younger teens, those aged 12 to 15, the likelihood of knowing their assailant in an assault was even higher, according to the 1991 data. About 46% of assault victims knew the offender, compared to only 16% for robbery victims.
And in violent crimes committed by a single offender against someone aged 12 to 19.
The majority of assaults, about 3/4, and over half of robberies were carried out by someone else in that 12 to 20-year-old age range. So
Yeah.
again, youth-on-youth violence.
The racial patterns in these single offender assaults and robberies are also quite distinct, right?
Yes, the paper notes that a high percentage, around 78% of assaults against white individuals were committed by white offenders. And similarly, 83% of assaults and 89% of robberies against black individuals were committed by black offenders.
So again, predominantly intraracial violence within these crime categories.
Seems to be the pattern.
And the involvement of alcohol, drugs, and weapons in these incidents is a really troubling aspect.
Absolutely. The paper indicates that a significant proportion of victims perceive the offender to be under the influence. About 1/3 of assault victims and 1/4 of robbery victims thought the attackers had been using drugs or alcohol.
And weapons.
Weapons were frequently involved. Over 1/4 of assaults and over half of robberies involved a weapon.
What kind of weapons?
Well, firearms were used in nearly 1/3 of the assaults where a weapon was involved, and in about half of the robberies where a weapon was involved. So guns playing a significant role here too.
Okay. Shifting our attention now to the sensitive topic of sexual assault. How does the paper define that?
It's defined broadly as sexual intimacy without consent, encompassing a wide spectrum of behaviors from unwanted touching all the way to rape.
And the paper emphasizes that adolescents and young adults face a heightened risk here as well.
Yes, both as victims and as perpetrators of rape specifically.
What were the estimates back in 1991?
The 1991 estimates suggested about 173,000 rapes occurred among those 12 and older. The rate was about 1.4 per 1,000 females, much lower for males at 0.2 per 1,000.
And the victims and offenders?
Tragically, 88% of victims were female, while 95% of offenders were male. And what's particularly concerning is that about half of all these reported rapes involved women between the ages of 12 and 24.
Half involved young women and girls. That really highlights the vulnerability of this age group again.
It does. The paper provides some really sobering statistics on rape victimization rates for women across different age groups, with the highest rate being among 16 to 19-year-olds at 7.1 per 1,000.
7 times higher than the overall female rate.
Yes. It also points to other factors that increase risk, like being divorced or separated, never married, young, single, living in urban areas, having recently moved, and having a lower income. These factors often intersect and create layers of vulnerability.
Looking at the arrest data for rape in 1991, what did that show?
There were about 30,350 arrests for rape made in 1991. Over half of those arrested were white, and almost all were male.
And age.
About 44% of these arrests involved individuals aged 10 to 24, indicating the involvement of younger people as perpetrators as well.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the NCVS captures unreported crime. Is underreporting a big issue with sexual assault?
It's absolutely crucial to understand that the official numbers likely only represent a fraction of the actual sexual assaults that occur. A large percentage of these incidents, even those that legally qualify as rape, go unreported.
Why is that?
Many reasons, but often victims don't recognize the experience as rape, especially in cases involving acquaintances or dating partners, the so-called acquaintance rape or date rape. There's also fear, shame, and concerns about not being believed. This makes it incredibly difficult to get a true sense of the prevalence.
Right. The paper actually cites a range of studies that found quite different rates of reported rape or attempted rape among women, right? Like 9% in one, up to 24% in another.
Exactly. That variation underscores this issue of underreporting and the challenges in accurately measuring the problem.
And beyond the most severe forms of sexual assault, like rape, the paper also touches on the prevalence of less extreme forms.
Yes, citing research on college students. These studies found there's a significant percentage of college men acknowledged engaging in unwanted touching, like 32% admitting to removing a woman's underclothing against her will, 61% touching a thigh or breast.
Wow. And for women?
A large national study found over half of college women reported experiencing some form of sexual victimization since they were 14.
Over half. What kinds of victimization?
Well, the types of experiences reported were quite varied and disturbing. About 14% reported unwanted contact without penetration, 12% reported intercourse achieved through coercive pressure, and 28% experienced attempted or actual penetrative sex against their will due to threats, force, or after being incapacitated by alcohol or drugs.
That's incredibly high. And what about male students as perpetrators in those studies?
Shockingly, about 25% of male college students in that national study reported engaging in some form of sexual aggression against women.
A quarter. Okay, what about trends in sexual assault over time?
When we look at the trends in reported rape victimization rates for females between the early 1970s and 1991, the paper notes that there wasn't a clear upward or downward trend overall. However,
However,
young women aged 16 to 24 consistently faced a higher risk throughout that period. But what is notable is that arrests of juveniles aged 10 to 17 for rape did double between 1965 and 1991.
so juvenile arrests doubled, even if overall reported victimization rates didn't show a clear trend. That suggests an increasing involvement of younger individuals in these crimes being caught, at least.
Potentially,
And
yes.
the circumstances surrounding sexual assault often involves the victim knowing the perpetrator, similar to other violence.
Yes, very much so. In 1991, over half of female rape victims aged 16 to 19, and nearly two-thirds of those aged 20 to 24 knew their attacker.
Where did these assaults tend to happen?
Frequently in private settings like homes or friends' houses. And tragically, alcohol or drugs were often involved in about 45% of all rapes, according to the paper.
Were weapons common?
Weapons were more likely to be used in rapes committed by strangers, about 31% of the time, compared to those committed by acquaintances, only about 8% of the time.
That makes sense. The paper also brings up dating violence specifically.
Yes, the issue of dating violence among adolescents and young adults is brought to light, with studies spanning several decades from the 50s through the 80s showing concerningly high percentages of college women reporting forceful sexual advances and men admitting to making such attempts.
And it wasn't just a college issue.
No, surveys of younger adolescents also found significant rates. One high school survey found 16% of females and 4% of males reported being forced into unwanted sexual activity while on a date.
And were they reporting this?
Alarmingly, disclosure rates were very low. Only about 22% told someone.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to physical fighting. How is that defined here?
The paper explains that this involves mutual aggression. Both people are involved in the fight. And it's a really significant factor in causing injuries and even contributing to homicides among young people.
And the patterns mirror other violence.
Yes, the patterns we see with physical fighting, unfortunately, mirror what we've seen with more severe forms of violence. It's more common among males and minority youth, and it often occurs between people who know each other, acquaintances usually.
How common was it?
The sheer scale of physical fighting among young people is quite striking. Using data from the 1991 Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, the YRBSS.
That's the high school survey.
Yes. It highlights that 42%, nearly half, of high school students reported being involved in a physical fight in the previous 12 months.
Wow, 42%. Were there differences?
Yes, male students reported higher rates, 50% than female students, 34%. And among male students, black males reported the highest rates, higher than white or Hispanic males.
And younger kids.
Other surveys mentioned the paper looking at 8th and 10th graders actually found even higher rates of involvement in physical fights than the high schoolers.
Interesting. What about kids not in school?
It's interesting to note that young people aged 12, 19 who are not enrolled in school were more likely to report being in physical fights, 51%, compared to those who were still attending school, 44%.
Were there good trend data on fighting back then?
Unfortunately, the paper points out that there wasn't a lot of consistent data over time on trends in physical fighting back then.
Yeah.
But the YRBSS was intended to provide that kind of longitudinal data going forward.
And the context. Who are they fighting?
As for the context of these fights, the paper reinforces the idea that physical fights most often involve people who know each other. For high school students who had ever been in a fight, the majority, 66% of their most recent fight, was with someone they knew, either an acquaintance or a family member.
So not usually random encounters.
No, it suggests they often stem from ongoing conflicts or relationships.
Okay. Let's now focus on interpersonal violence, specifically within the school setting. This is a big concern today. Was it seen as new back then?
The paper emphasizes that despite the increased attention and concern in more recent times, violence in schools is absolutely not a new issue.
That's a really important point. What about school-related homicides? Was that tracked?
Not really consistently. While there wasn't a uniform national system for tracking school-related homicides like there might be now, the paper cites reports from groups like the Center to Prevent Handgun Violence and the National School Safety Center in the late 1980s and early 1990s.
What did they find?
They documented a significant number of gun-related deaths, maybe around 71 over a 4-year period, and other violent deaths occurring in or around schools, maybe 33 in one school year. But this lack of standardized reporting at the time made it difficult to really understand the full scope and track trends effectively.
Right. But even without comprehensive homicide data, we do have information on other forms of violence in schools, like fighting, weapons, other crimes.
Yes, definitely. A 1993 survey by the National School Boards Association, the NSBA, found that a large majority, 82% of school districts, reported an increase in student violence in the previous 5 years.
An increase reported by most districts. What was most common?
The most frequently reported issue was students assaulting other students. 78% of districts reported that. The presence of weapons was also identified as a problem by 61% of districts, and that was higher in urban areas.
What kinds of things were happening in urban schools?
Some urban districts reported shootings, knifings, drive-by shootings near schools, even rapes occurring in schools. Pretty serious stuff.
And did principals and students see it the same way?
Yes, surveys of both principals and students themselves corroborate these findings. About 22% of principals in a 1992 survey reported physical conflicts as a serious or moderate problem in their schools, again, higher in cities.
And students.
A 1993 MetLife survey of students from grades 3–12 found 24% reported being kicked, bitten, or hit at school, and 26% said they did this to others.
So victims and perpetrators overlap. Any pattern?
Male students were more likely to be physically aggressive. And sadly, the data also suggested that students who were struggling academically, those with poor grades, were more likely to be both victims and perpetrators of violence in schools. Other studies also found high rates of fighting reported by students.
The issue of students carrying weapons in schools is particularly alarming. What did the surveys find?
Surveys from the late 1980s and early 1990s indicated that a notable percentage of students admitted carrying weapons. An ASH survey in '89 found 23% of 8th and 10th grade males carried a knife, 3% carried a handgun. The MetLife survey found 13% overall had ever carried a weapon to school, males higher than females.
Oh, wow. Even handguns. Were they using them?
Another survey from '93 found a percentage of students had carried a weapon recently, and tragically, some students reported being threatened or injured with a weapon at school. Black and Hispanic students reported higher rates of weapon-related victimization. About 3% of all students admitted threatening someone with a knife or gun.
So weapons were present and sometimes used. What about violent crime generally in schools over the longer term?
Well, when we look at the data on violent crime within schools spanning from the mid-1970s, like a 1976 NIE study, through the early 1990s, like a 1991 BJS survey, it reveals a persistent problem of attacks, robberies, and thefts taking place on school grounds.
Who was involved?
The paper highlights that the majority of this violence involves students attacking other students, often of the same sex and race. It seemed more likely in junior highs, schools with more males, and larger schools.
Did school environment matter?
Yes, factors such as the overall school climate, how connected students felt to school values, and the level of perceived social control within the school seemed to play a role in the prevalence of violence, according to that older NIE study.
What about victimization rates inside schools more recently in the early 90s?
Victimization rates within schools were also tracked. The 1991 BJS School Crime Survey found about 9% of students aged 12–19 reported being victims of some crime in or around their school in the previous 6 months.
Only 9%. That seems lower than the fighting stats.
Well, only 2% was violent crime, mostly simple assaults. 7% was property crime. So less severe stuff was more common victimization-wise than the fighting prevalence suggests. Interestingly, violent victimization rates inside school were fairly similar for male and female students and across different racial groups, according to that survey.
Who is more likely to be a victim?
Rates tended to be higher for younger students, like those in 6th and 9th grades, and lower for seniors. Also, students who moved more frequently were more likely to be victims. Other surveys, like the ASHA one, found higher percentages reporting threats, attacks, or robberies at school over the past year.
And teachers, were they safe?
Tragically, teachers were also not immune to this violence. The older NIE study found small percentages attacked or robbed monthly. More recent surveys in the early 90s found about 29% of teachers reported verbal abuse as a problem, 3% physical abuse, higher in cities. About 7–10% reported being threatened, and 2–3% physically attacked by a student in the past year. The MetLife survey found 11% of teachers were victims of violence at school, mostly by students.
And this violence within schools, unsurprisingly, had a significant impact on the educational process itself, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Teachers reported feeling hesitant to confront misbehaving students out of fear. The NIE study found 12% felt that way, even higher in big cities. Many felt that disruptive behavior was a major obstacle to their ability to teach effectively.
Did it make them want to leave?
Some teachers, maybe around 29% in one study, even reported considering leaving the profession altogether due to the challenges posed by student misbehavior. A third of teachers in the MetLife survey felt colleagues were less eager to go to school or less likely to discipline because of violence.
And how did it affect students' learning and feelings about school?
From the students' perspective, many reported feeling less eager to attend school, less willing to participate in class, and a sense that violence was negatively affecting the quality of their education. Some students, maybe 4% in the NIE study, up to 7% of 8th graders in the Leader study, even stayed home from school out of fear for their safety. About a quarter felt violence lessened education quality in the MetLife survey.
It's absolutely crucial to understand that violence within schools isn't isolated, right? It's connected to the community.
Exactly. The paper emphasizes that what we see happening in schools largely reflects the broader societal issues and often stems from factors outside the school walls, such as the level of crime in the neighborhood and the presence of gang activity.
Were there studies showing that link?
Yes. Studies of inner-city schools, for example, found a clear link between gun-related violence in and around schools and things like socio-demographic factors, exposure to violence outside of school, and involvement in activities that tend to lead to violence. This really underscores that school violence is part of a larger societal problem, not just something happening within the school bubble.
Did violence mostly happen in school?
Interestingly, a survey of high school students in New York City actually found that the majority of threats and physical fights that students experienced did not occur inside the school building, and carrying weapons was less common inside the school itself compared to other settings.
So it spills over from the community into the school environment.
Precisely. It reinforces the connection between what's happening in schools and the broader community environment.
So when we look at the bigger picture, what are the underlying factors that contribute to this complex and troubling issue of youth violence? Where does it come from?
The paper explains that the roots of violence are often established in childhood and then become more pronounced during adolescence, influenced by a combination of individual factors and broader societal forces.
Okay, let's break that down. Individual factors first. What about just being an adolescent?
On the individual level, the developmental changes of adolescence play a significant role. This is a period of rapid psychological and physical changes. Figuring out who you are, dealing with hormones, navigating complex social relationships.
Yeah, it's a tough time.
It can lead to increased sensitivity to social slights or embarrassment, a greater tendency towards risk-taking behavior, and maybe a higher likelihood of reacting, well, violently to stressful situations, especially when weapons are easily accessible. That combination can be dangerous.
Makes sense. What about family influences? How critical are they?
Absolutely critical. Violence can be a learned behavior within the family. Patterns of aggression, if established early, tend to become more stable over time.
So what helps prevent it?
Creating nurturing home environments where conflicts are resolved nonviolently is essential. The paper highlights several family factors that are often found in the backgrounds of violent adolescence.
Like what?
Things like lack of parental supervision, parental indifference or rejection, and even parental criminal behavior. Also, deficiencies in things like monitoring children's activities, using consistent and non-harsh discipline, teaching problem-solving skills, and modeling positive social behavior. All those things matter.
And what about witnessing or experiencing violence at home?
Tragically, early childhood experiences of violence in the home, particularly physical abuse, have a profound and lasting impact on increasing aggressive behavior later in life. That link is very strong, according to the research cited.
Okay, so development and family are key. What about peers?
Peer influences are another really important piece of this puzzle. As adolescents strive for belonging and acceptance among their peers, that's huge for teenagers, peer pressure can exert a powerful influence.
Pushing them towards violence sometimes?
Yes, sometimes leading to involvement in violence, especially in communities where violence is more common or even seen as a way to gain status or respect.
And gangs fit in here.
Exactly. Violent gang activity is a prime example of peer-influenced antisocial behavior. The paper cites estimates of, like, 1.5 million gang members across the country back then. And the presence of gangs in schools was linked to increased violence, fear, and victimization for other students.
Was gang violence mostly about drugs?
While drug dealing can definitely bring money to gangs and be a source of conflict, it's important to remember that not all gang violence is solely about drugs. There can be an inherent culture of violence within these groups. Rivalries, turf wars, initiation rituals, juvenile gang killings saw a massive increase, over 600% between 87 and 91.
Wow. Okay, so those are individual and peer factors. Then we move to the significant role of broader societal factors. What does the paper say about media?
The impact of violence in media, particularly television and movies, comes under scrutiny. The paper points out that children are exposed to an enormous amount of violence through these channels. One estimate was 200,000 acts by age 16, including 33,000 murders.
That's a staggering amount. Does it have an effect?
Research cited in the paper suggests viewing violence can contribute to increased aggression, a greater acceptance of violence as a way to solve problems, a desensitization becoming blunted to the consequences of violence, and what's sometimes called a mean worldview, where people perceive the world as more dangerous than it actually is.
So mostly negative effects.
Primarily, yes. However, the paper also offers a glimmer of hope, noting that media could potentially be part of the solution by modeling non-violent ways of resolving conflicts.
Okay. What about alcohol and drugs?
Alcohol and other drugs also play a very prominent role in interpersonal violence, according to the Department of Health and Human Services report cited. Studies have shown that in at least half of violent incidents, either the perpetrator or the victim, or both, had been drinking alcohol.
Why does alcohol contribute?
Well, alcohol's disinhibiting effects can certainly be a contributing factor, lowering impulse control, impairing judgment. Violence often occurs in settings where alcohol is readily available and consumed. The association is particularly strong in homicides and rapes involving friends or acquaintances.
And other drugs.
When it comes to other drugs, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NID, conservatively estimated back then that at least 10% of homicides and assaults were drug-related. A framework was proposed by Goldstein to understand this.
What was that framework?
It had 3 parts: psychopharmacologic violence, violence due to the drug's effects, economic compulsive violence, violence committed to get money for drugs, and systemic violence, violence related to the drug trade itself, like turf wars. Systemic violence was thought to account for the majority of drug-related homicides.
And were young people involved in the drug trade?
The paper highlights the rise in juvenile arrests for drug offenses, especially heroin and cocaine, which increased over 700% between 1980 and 1990. Illicit drugs, particularly cocaine, were seen as playing a major role in urban crime and trauma.
Did drug availability affect schools?
Yes, the availability of alcohol and drugs within schools was also linked to increased violence and fear among students, according to the BJS data. Students who said it was easy to get drugs at school were more likely to be afraid or become victims.
Okay, another big societal factor, access to weapons, especially firearms.
Yes, a critical factor. The paper highlights that 26% of high school students in the 1991 CDC survey reported carrying a weapon in the past 30 days, males more than females, some racial differences too.
What kinds of weapons?
Knives or razors were the most common, but handguns were next. And again, out-of-school youth were more likely to carry weapons than in-school youth.
And carrying a weapon increases risk, obviously.
Tragically, yes. Carrying weapons, especially firearms, dramatically increases the likelihood of a violent encounter turning fatal. The consequences are just so much higher.
Firearms were a leading cause of death.
Firearm homicide was the second leading cause of death for 15 to 19-year-olds back then, with that rapid increase we talked about happening in the 1980s.
How many guns were out there?
The paper estimated around 200 million firearms in the U.S. at the time, increasing by 10 million per decade. And access for youth seemed to be increasing, correlating with rises in juvenile weapon arrests and juvenile murders involving guns.
What percentage of youth homicides involved guns?
Firearms were used in 80% of homicides of those aged 10 to 24 in 1991. As we said, the recent homicide increase was largely attributed to firearms.
Did kids feel like they could get guns easily?
Surveys, like one in Seattle in 1992, indicated that about a third of urban high school students felt they had easy access to handguns. About 6% actually owned one, more common among males and those with other problem behaviors. And chillingly, about a third of those handgun owners had actually fired it at someone.
Fired it at someone? Wow. Okay, finally, socioeconomic status. How does that fit in?
It's deeply intertwined with the issue of interpersonal violence. The paper points out, citing various sources, including the CDC, that most homicides tend to occur in urban areas characterized by poverty, high population density, inadequate housing, and high unemployment.
So poverty is a major factor. What about race?
While racial and ethnic minorities are disproportionately affected by violence, the research cited suggests that poverty and living in low-income neighborhoods are actually stronger predictors of violence than race alone.
Stronger than race. How so?
When socioeconomic status is taken into account, statistically controlled for, the racial disparities in violence rates tend to decrease significantly. One study mentioned use housing density as a proxy for socioeconomic status and found that racial differences in homicide rates were essentially eliminated when that was controlled for.
So it's less about race itself and more about the conditions associated with poverty and inequality.
That's the argument presented based on that research. It underscores the fundamental role that economic opportunity and social inequality play in shaping patterns of violence.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the 1995 paper, Adolescents at Risk for Violence, the key takeaway really seems to be that youth violence is incredibly complex with really deep roots.
Absolutely. It's not caused by any single thing, but rather by a complex interplay, a combination of individual factors related to adolescent development, family dynamics, and peer influences.
Right, interacting with those broader societal issues we just discussed, like the pervasive presence of violence in media, the role of substance abuse, the easy availability of weapons, especially firearms, and those underlying socioeconomic disparities and inequalities.
And it's really important to remember that the significant escalation of youth violence that occurred in the late 1980s and early to mid-1990s clearly demanded a multifaceted approach to prevention. There was, and likely still is, no single magic bullet.
Right, you can't just fix one thing.
Exactly. Instead, it required addressing these interconnected contributing factors simultaneously through various avenues, including educational programs, legal and regulatory changes aimed at things like weapon access or alcohol availability, and efforts to improve the physical and social environments in communities.
The paper briefly touches on a framework for this, right, from the CDC.
Yes, a framework for community-based prevention strategies. This framework included things like educational approaches, think mentoring programs, training in conflict resolution skills.
Also, legal actions.
Right, legal actions aimed at restricting access to weapons and alcohol for young people, enforcing existing laws. And environmental changes, simple things like increasing lighting in public spaces to deter crime, or broader efforts to foster a greater sense of community ownership and safety.
And crucially, the paper highlights the vital role that schools can play, not just as sites of violence, but as part of the solution.
Yes, exactly. Schools can be incredibly influential in shaping young people's values and behaviors. Comprehensive, skills-based violence prevention education within schools.
But not just in isolation.
Right. When that education is coordinated with broader community-wide efforts involving families, local organizations, social service agencies, law enforcement, that coordinated approach is presented as a really promising avenue for addressing this complex problem.
So as we conclude this deep dive, here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to consider. Given this intricate and interconnected web of factors that contribute to youth violence, the individual, the family, the peers, the media, substances, weapons, poverty.
That's a lot to juggle.
It is. What single fundamental shift in our communities do you believe would ultimately have the most profound and lasting impact on reducing this critical issue?
That's a tough question. No easy answers.
Definitely something to think about and perhaps explore further on your own. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.